Brutal prisons, where punishment stops being the sentence. Prisons were created to remove dangerous people from society. They were meant to contain, to correct, and, at least in theory, to rehabilitate. But across history, many prisons have evolved into something else entirely. In these places, punishment does not end with the sentence handed down in court. It begins after the cell door closes. Violence is not always loud. Sometimes it is constant. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it is built so deeply into the system that it no longer needs to be enforced by force. These are brutal prisons, not because they are chaotic, but because they are designed to break people in different ways. To understand how prisons became this way, you have to understand one uncomfortable truth: brutality inside prisons is rarely accidental. The illusion of control from the outside, many of the world's most brutal prisons appear orderly. Tall walls. Guard towers. Schedules that run on time. Rules posted clearly. This appearance creates an illusion that suffering inside prisons is the result of individual behavior, not system design. In reality, brutality emerges when control fails, or when control becomes absolute. Some prisons collapse into chaos. Others tighten until there is no room left for humanity. Both paths lead to the same outcome. When overcrowding becomes a weapon, one of the most common sources of prison brutality is overcrowding. Prisons are often built to hold a specific number of people. When political crises, mass arrests, or weak legal systems overwhelm those limits, space disappears. Privacy disappears. Sanitation disappears. Order follows soon after. Cells meant for 10 people hold 50. Dormitories meant for 50 hold hundreds. People sleep in shifts. Some stand for days. Overcrowding turns survival into competition. Food becomes scarce. Medical care becomes inaccessible. Protection becomes transactional. Violence doesn't need to be encouraged. It emerges naturally when resources vanish. Prisons where the state lost control. In some of the world's most infamous prisons, the government technically owns the facility, but does not control it. In these prisons, guards remain outside cell blocks. Armed groups enforce rules inside. Power shifts from the state to gangs, militias, or informal hierarchies built on fear. These prisons are brutal not because of strict discipline, but because there is none. Punishment becomes arbitrary. Protection is bought, not guaranteed. Weakness is exploited openly. When the state retreats, brutality fills the vacuum. Violence as currency. In uncontrolled prisons, violence becomes currency. Influence is earned through fear. Territory is defended through force. Status is maintained through intimidation. The strongest survive. The weakest disappear. In these environments, brutality is not hidden. It is visible, normalized, and expected. People adapt quickly, or they don't survive. But chaos is only one form of prison brutality. The most sophisticated systems took a different route. When brutality became organized, as some prisons collapsed into disorder, others moved in the opposite direction. Instead of allowing chaos, authorities tightened control. They removed shared spaces. They restricted movement. They isolated individuals long before conflict could form. This strategy reduced riots and visible violence. It also created a new kind of brutality, one that does not rely on physical force. Isolation as punishment. Long-term isolation was originally introduced as a temporary measure, a way to separate people during investigations or emergencies. In brutal prison systems, it became permanent. People were confined alone for months. Then years. Then decades. Cells became entire worlds. Concrete walls. Steel doors. A narrow window showing sky, but nothing else. Human contact became minimal and procedural. This environment does not look violent. That is why it is so dangerous. The silent effects of isolation. Medical research has shown, repeatedly, that extended isolation causes predictable psychological damage. Anxiety intensifies. Sleep breaks down. Memory weakens. Emotional regulation collapses. Some people experience paranoia. Some experience hallucinations. Others withdraw completely. These effects do not require physical abuse. They are produced by the environment itself. In brutal prisons, this damage is not treated as harm. It is treated as compliance failure. Discipline that feeds itself. In many brutal prison systems, psychological deterioration is punished with further restriction. Disorientation is labeled defiance. Emotional breakdown is labeled misconduct. Withdrawal is labeled suspicious behavior. Each response justifies more isolation. The system feeds on its own consequences. This is brutality without bruises. The role of fear. Fear is a powerful management tool. Some prisons rely on fear of other inmates. Others rely on fear of guards. The most brutal rely on fear of time itself. Not knowing when isolation will end. Not knowing if conditions will change. Not knowing whether compliance will matter. Fear becomes constant. And constant fear reshapes behavior permanently. Brutality without spectacle. The most brutal prisons are not always the loudest. They do not always produce riots or dramatic footage. They do not always generate headlines. Instead, they operate quietly. Paperwork replaces force. Procedures replace confrontation. Time replaces punishment. This makes brutality harder to challenge. There is nothing dramatic to point to. No single incident to investigate. No moment where violence clearly begins. It is everywhere, all the time. When brutality is justified as safety, every brutal prison system uses the same justification. Safety. Safety of guards. Safety of other prisoners. Safety of the public. These arguments are not entirely false. Many brutal measures do reduce visible violence. But they do so by shifting harm inward, away from public view. The question becomes not whether violence exists, but where it is allowed to happen. The human cost. No one measures. Prison systems measure success using statistics. Assault rates. Escape attempts. Operational efficiency. What they rarely measure is psychological damage. They do not track loss of identity. They do not track emotional numbness. They do not track how long it takes for someone to feel human again. Brutality that cannot be quantified is easy to ignore. The path toward extreme prisons. By the late 20th century, many governments faced a choice. Allow chaotic prisons that threaten stability, or build controlled prisons that eliminate visible disorder. Many chose control. This decision created the most extreme prisons in the world. Facilities designed not to rehabilitate, but to neutralize. Not to punish temporarily, but to contain indefinitely. This is where brutality evolved again. A dividing line. There is a dividing line in the world's brutal prisons. On one side are prisons defined by chaos, overcrowding, and physical violence. On the other side are prisons defined by silence, isolation, and psychological erosion. Both destroy lives. But they do it in very different ways. And the second type is harder to see. Why this matters? Brutal prisons do not exist in isolation from society. They shape the people inside them. They shape the staff who work there. And eventually, they shape the communities people return to, if they return at all. Damage does not stay behind walls. It leaks outward slowly. Because there is a moment when punishment stops being a response to behavior and becomes a permanent condition. A moment when control is no longer used to manage prisons, but to redefine what a prison is meant to do. This is where the most brutal prisons in the world exist. Not in chaos, but in silence. The rise of permanent isolation. Isolation was never meant to be permanent. It began as a short-term solution, separating people during investigations, cooling off conflict, preventing immediate harm. But in some prison systems, isolation proved so effective at suppressing disorder that it expanded quietly. Weeks became months. Months became years. Years became decades. Entire facilities were redesigned around this logic. Single-occupancy cells replaced dormitories. Shared spaces were eliminated. Movement was reduced to minutes per day. This was not accidental. It was policy. The architecture of erasure. The most brutal modern prisons are built to remove almost everything that defines human life. Cells are concrete boxes. Furniture is fixed. Windows show sky, not landscape. Sound is absorbed. Light is regulated. There is no variation. No privacy. No unpredictability. This environment is not neutral. It actively reshapes the mind. When people are deprived of social interaction, sensory stimulation, and control over their environment, the brain changes how it functions. Stress becomes constant. Emotions flatten. Memory fragments. This damage is not rare. It is expected. Silence as a weapon. In these prisons, silence is not peace. It is pressure. Days pass without conversation. Weeks pass without touch. Years pass without meaningful human presence. People begin to fear sound, not because it is loud, but because it is unfamiliar. Some stop speaking entirely. Others lose the ability to organize thoughts into language. Silence becomes the punishment. And because silence leaves no physical marks, it is easier to justify. When brutality is invisible, the most brutal prisons are not the ones that produce viral footage. They do not burn. They do not riot. They do not explode. They function smoothly. Paperwork replaces force. Procedures replace confrontation. Cameras replace witnesses. Everything is documented. Everything is justified. Everything is routine. This makes brutality difficult to challenge, because nothing appears out of control. Psychological damage as misconduct. One of the most disturbing aspects of extreme prison systems is how psychological deterioration is interpreted. Confusion becomes defiance. Emotional breakdown becomes rule violation. Withdrawal becomes suspicious behavior. Instead of relief, the response is often further restriction. More isolation. Less movement. Fewer privileges. The system treats symptoms as threats. And in doing so, deepens the damage it caused. Self-directed violence. As physical violence disappears from controlled prisons, another form increases. Self-harm. This does not always take dramatic forms. Sometimes it is subtle. Sometimes it is slow. Sometimes it is simply neglect of self. These acts rarely make headlines. They happen alone. Behind closed doors. Under surveillance cameras. They are recorded in reports, not stories. The system responds clinically, but rarely changes the conditions that caused the harm. Time without end. Perhaps the most brutal element of extreme prisons is not isolation alone. It is indefinite isolation. In many of the world's harshest prisons, people are not given clear timelines. Progress depends on compliance, psychological evaluations, and administrative decisions that are often opaque. There is no guaranteed release from isolation. No fixed end date. No reliable measure of success. This uncertainty is devastating. Without an end point, the mind struggles to cope. Hope becomes dangerous. Motivation collapses. Time stops feeling linear and becomes oppressive. Punishment no longer feels temporary. It feels permanent. Control over identity. In the most brutal prisons, identity erodes. People stop being defined by their actions. They are defined by their risk level, their classification, their housing status. Names matter less than numbers. Personal history matters less than compliance. Over time, some people stop thinking of themselves as individuals at all. This is not accidental. A person without identity is easier to control. Why these prisons persist despite international criticism, human rights reports, and legal challenges, the most brutal prisons continue to operate. The reason is simple. They work, by certain standards. They reduce riots. They reduce assaults. They reduce visible disorder. For administrators, this is success. The damage is considered an acceptable cost. Safety versus humanity. Every extreme prison system uses the same argument. Safety. Safety for staff. Safety for other prisoners. Safety for the public. These concerns are real. But they create a dangerous trade-off. When safety becomes the only goal, humanity becomes optional. And once humanity is optional, brutality becomes policy. The global pattern. Although the world's most brutal prisons exist in different countries, cultures, and legal systems, they share striking similarities. Isolation. Indefinite confinement. Psychological erosion. Minimal oversight. Limited transparency. These similarities suggest something unsettling. Brutal prisons are not cultural accidents. They are structural solutions to the same problem. What to do with people a system no longer knows how to manage. The cost that follows damage done inside brutal prisons does not stay there. People eventually leave, through transfer, release, or collapse. But years of isolation do not disappear. Social interaction becomes overwhelming. Noise becomes distressing. Trust becomes fragile. Some people never fully recover. The prison sentence ends. The prison does not. Brutality without accountability. One of the most dangerous features of extreme prisons is how little oversight they receive. Remote locations. Restricted access. Limited media presence. The fewer people who see inside, the easier it is for brutality to normalize. Silence protects the system. The moral question no system answers. Every brutal prison raises the same question. At what point does punishment stop being justice and become harm for its own sake? There is no universal answer. But there is evidence. Evidence of broken minds. Evidence of erased identities. Evidence of damage that lasts long after confinement ends. The end of the line. Brutal prisons represent the end of a long road. A road that begins with overcrowding, continues through control, and ends with isolation so complete it erases the person inside. These prisons are not mistakes. They are choices. Choices made when systems value order over humanity, efficiency over rehabilitation, silence over accountability. Final reflection. The most brutal prisons in the world are not always the loudest. They do not always bleed. They do not always burn. They operate quietly. They function efficiently. They erase people slowly. And that is why they are the hardest to confront. Because brutality that screams demands attention. But brutality that whispers can last forever.